Welcome to the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History. The center was established by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in January of 2024. Its purpose is to foster the study of Baha'i history, Baha'i sacred texts, Baha'i philosophical and theological concepts, and world religions from a Baha'i and comparative perspective. I am Robert Stockman, director of the center, and joining me today is Nancy Lee Harper, a pianist who has performed and taught in 29 countries on 4 continents. Nancy holds a Doctor of Musical Arts degree in piano performance from the University of North Texas, now retired from the Universidade de Aveiro in Portugal, where she was the head of piano and supervised master's, PhD, and postdoctoral research. Nancy currently serves as a long-term pioneer to that country. Well, that says served, but she's now actually retired, having made several moves from Portugal, is now in Canada, I should add, and has been in California as well. She has authored over 250 scientific articles, various books on musical subjects, and recorded several CDs. Her music is available for listening on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud, among other platforms. Her name figures in the American Keyboard Artists and Marquis Who's Who. In 2006, she was nominated for a prize from the Samii Hussein-Pour Foundation in Belgium. And in her retirement, she's written on various Baha'i topics. And that includes a plan now, of course, to work on a biography of Millie Collins, work that has made considerable progress. And today, of course, she will be elaborating more on Millie Collins. So we are looking forward to your presentation on the various misunderstandings and misconceptions about Millie Collins. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nancy. And I will now turn on your slideshow and turn off my camera and microphone and turn over the program to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. It's a great pleasure and joy to be here, not to mention an honor. And with me today is my husband, Baron Harper, who inspired this whole study on Hand of the Cause, Amelia Collins. So he'll be reading some of the passages with me. The topic, as you see, is Dialectical Discourse, Untangling 7 Conceptions about the Hand of the Cause, Amelia E. Collins, 1873 to 1962. Most of you listening are already very well aware of her many services to the faith and her great generosity as well. I want to share with you first, before we get into this presentation, an early letter. Actually, it's a postscript on a letter on his behalf by the Guardian to Millie in 1927. He said, as though it were a prediction and a truth, your constancy in service and your single-minded and wholehearted devotion to the manifold interest of our beloved cause are truly an example and an inspiration that will live and influence many a soul. Your endeavors will eventually be crowned with success, and I trust you will live to witness the fruit of your indefatigable services to this sacred threshold. The dialectical discourse topic or theme was chosen because during my research I found discrepancies. Dialectical because we have so many opposites in our faith. We have light and dark, heat, cold, crisis, victory, and so forth. So by taking an approach that looks at the opposite of what is being said, we may be able to unravel the truth. I have taken 7 examples that particularly bothered me during my research, and this research has been going on since 2015. And I've tried to figure out exactly what was the truth, or what was she really saying. So the first example, let's see if I can get this to change now. There we go. It comes from Actually, the first three examples come from the book by Mr. Fazey. And we use stories often in our research that give it a particular insight, and they have a value for us that, while they may not hold all of the truth, they share insights and partial truths that help us get to the real kernel of the truth. And one researcher, a group of researchers, gave insight into this value by saying individual life stories are very much embedded in social relationships and structures, and they are expressed in culturally specific forms. Read carefully, they provide unique insights into the connections between the individual life trajectories and collective forces and institutions beyond the individual. Thus, they offer a methodologically privileged location from which to comprehend human agency. So in all of the examples, I have created the thesis or the object of study, then the arguments or counterpoints, and then the final solution or synthesis. Example 1, which comes from the early part, pages 3 and 5 of the Fazey book, has the thesis that Millie carried and explained a letter from the Guardian to the 1923 National Convention of the United States and Canada. You will remember that at that time there was only one NSA that was shared between the two countries. So we're going to begin reading from this, from the book. My husband and I will share the reading so that you get an idea of the story before we examine the truths of it.
One evening, the beloved guardian gave Millie some papers and asked her to study them. As she related this incident to us, she explained that before attaining the presence of the beloved guardian, her sole aim was to learn from him some truths about prayer and purification of the soul and heart. She said,
"To me, he was a door to the world beyond, and through him I longed to have a glimpse of that wondrous world. Therefore, with great eagerness and anticipation, I hurried to my room, opened the papers, and read and read. The next day when I saw him, his first question was,
'What did you think of the papers I gave you to read?' At this point, dearest Millie always used to stop to tell us the following.
I started my spiritual life on a basis of truth and frankness. Whatever I felt in my heart, whether right or wrong, I would say without fear of consequence. Now I was standing before the person who could read the innermost recesses of my heart and soul. How could I speak anything but the simple truth? Those papers contain nothing but explanations and elucidations of the world order of Baha'u'llah and how it should be established in the world. And I desired only to know about prayer and glimpses of the world beyond. Therefore, I could only answer the guardian's question with these words. What shall I say? I did not understand anything.
Here again, she would pause and look deeply into the faces of the friends and say,
Do you think he reproved me for this? Never. On the same day in the afternoon, he told me that the master had walked often in these lanes and streets near his house, and the guardian invited me to go walking with him. As we were walking together, he spoke of nothing except the same subject he had written about in the papers he had given me to read. But with what a voice and with what sweetness! Words cannot describe them. He explained the details with such patience as a father would to a child. But my idea was still lurking in my mind, and I was constantly thinking to myself that soon he would speak the words that would, each one, open a door into the mysteries of prayer and the world of the spirit, which I longed so much to know more about. How can we, insignificant and weak as we are, understand the plans of God? We are confined to our humble and limited circumstances, unaware of what he may have in store for us. The guardian who is beginning to delineate the spiritual foundations of the kingdom of God on earth began to educate me in the administrative principles of the faith, in spite of my own desires. When I returned to America, I went directly to the National Convention and arrived during the reading of that very message from the beloved guardian, which he had given me to read in Haifa. I found myself called to the front, and the words that I spoke came from some deep well of consciousness. That afternoon's walk with Shoghi Effendi and those exalted statements heard from no less a person than Abdu'l-Bahá's successor were like seeds that dear teacher had implanted in my mind and heart. And now each one was bursting forth into expression of these new ideas. And later, where I went, I found that the friends had received that same letter. It's dated March 12th, 1923, and that they and the members of the spiritual assemblies were busily engaged in discussing it. Sometimes there were clashes of thought and misunderstanding, and these I found I had been prepared by the beloved guardian to explain and throw light upon. I had been given by him that which was necessary for the service and advancement of the cause, and not that which would satisfy my own selfish desires. So I think that you understand what the thesis is. The counterpoints or the arguments are, what are the facts and what do they mean? As I was examining dates of the passenger manifest of ship records, I could not find that Millie had arrived in time to make this convention. I found that she arrived perhaps 5 days later. And I know that passenger manifests or even any of the ship records are subject to error. So then I consulted the National Convention records, which are quite substantial, several hundred pages in length, and are quite detailed, often not revealing everything that we get in the reports, the published reports that appear, such as in Baha'i News, but in great further detail. And they too do not support that Millie arrived at the inn. In fact, they do not show her as even being present. She is, however, present in the 1924 convention, but the topics under discussion were quite different. So I was trying to reconcile these two divergencies. And I came to the conclusion that Millie no doubt spoke to some large group, but it probably was not the 23 National Convention. It could have been possibly in California, where she lived and certainly worked quite extensively at the time. And of course, the Guardian's message was very important and timely, and she always was extremely obedient to the Guardian's wishes. So there's no doubt in my mind that part of this is true, but the place is other than what is recorded. So going on to the second example, also from the Faizi book, she says, and this is taken from pages 5 and 6, the thesis is that Millie was a child when her father died, peeping into his open coffin for a last look, and that her dead father sat up again and came to life. So in this story it goes, many members of my family were Christian clergymen. My father himself was a Lutheran minister.
It is a custom among Christians that when a member of the family passes away, he is laid to rest in his coffin. And before the lid is closed, those attending the funeral and the members of the family are allowed to have a last look at their deceased loved one and pay their final homage.
I remember that as a small child, when my father passed away and I was taken to the coffin to have a last look at him, I stood there and peeped into the coffin, and this incident remains vivid in my mind. During my first pilgrimage, one night I dreamt that I was in the very same position, but that my father arose in his coffin as if awakened. This frightened me so much that I woke up perplexed. The next day, I was to meet the greatest holy leaf. She was on her pilgrimage in 1923. And no one can imagine the condition I was in at that prospect. It was no joke for a humble, insignificant creature like myself to enter the presence of the daughter of the King of heaven and earth. She, immediately with her loving and keen insight, understood the great agitation I was in. She very gently asked me how I was. Did I sleep well? But not once did I think of my dream. Tea was served, and what a delicious feast! But I was still in the same disturbed state. As I was drinking my tea, she asked me.
Did you have a dream?
She asked me a second time, and suddenly I remembered my dream and told her about it. She smiled and said,
Of course, your faith in this cause has brought your father back to life again.
So the counterpoints of this example are that Conrad, her father, who was a Lutheran minister and quite prominent in his work in a certain area of the northeast of the United States, died in 1903. He was born in 1837. He immigrated to the United States in the mid-50s and then died in the early 20th century. At the time of his death, Millie was 29 years old. So I thought, well, perhaps the dream had to do with her grandfathers, but then they had died in the 1850s before she was born. And they were not particularly busy with seminary and theology. So Millie, at the time of the dream, was 50. So she was not a child. However, I suppose in the dream she was a child. So trying to reconcile these facts with the story, I came to the conclusion that according to the greatest holy leaf, the interpretation of Millie's dream is that her faith in the Baha'i cause awakened and made him conscious and brought him back to life. It's really irrelevant whether or not she was a child at the time, but in the dream, she was a child. The third example also comes from Mr. Frazie's book. The thesis that Millie stated that she memorized only one passage from the writings and strove to follow it. And that was a phrase from the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha to make Shoghi Effendi happy. This excerpt is from pages 16 to 17.
Millie often said that she knew very little about the writings, but loved to listen to the tablets and prayers and to hear the stories of the early days of the cause.
Out of the immense treasury of all the writings, she said, I memorized one sentence and did my utmost to follow that one injunction. It served as a lamp of guidance, shedding light on the dark and obscure paths of my life. That phrase is from the Will and Testament of the Master, where he says that the friend should make Shoghi Effendi happy. Whatever step I took in my life, any vote cast in the assemblies, any trip taken, even any thought, I would first ask myself whether my vote, words, trip, or thought would make him happy. When I was sure, then I would take action without fear. So the arguments for her paucity, if you will, of memorizing are that in a letter to Leroy, Iowa, 31 October 1937, she informs him or tells him that she has memorized the non-obligatory prayer, taking 2 months to do so. She was in Germany at the time. It was right after her husband's passing, and so she had a lot of soul searching and agony to work through, and this is one of the comforts that she had from this practice. There's another reference in 1945 that while accompanying Dorothy Baker and Gail Wilson to the train station for Mexico City, she recited the tablet of visitation, and I assume it is the tablet from the Master. So I think the meaning of Millie's I guess you could say an exaggeration, but her statement is that whatever her uppermost thought and motive was to make the guardian happy, And by saying this, she in no way glorified herself, for humility characterized all of her acts. She frequently asked that her name not be associated with any gift or with any service. So, then the fourth example, these conclude the examples from the Feyzi book, is one that has to do with her appointment as being hand of the cause in 1951. To Millie, the Guardian wrote, a cable from the Guardian to Amelia Collins on 22 November 1946 read,
Your magnificent international services, exemplary devotion, and now the signaled service impel me inform you your elevation, rank, hand cause Baha'u'llah. You are the first to be told this honor in lifetime. As to time announcement, leave it my discretion.
So synthesizing the discrepancy of the dates from 46 to 51, both are true. She, of course, never revealed this great honor upon her. And in a similar way, she never revealed the contents of the master's letter to her in 1919. She was a very private person. So officially, this thesis is true because the appointment of the first contingent did happen formally in 1951, the official act. However, it is also true that the Guardian intended to appoint her and that she had deserved already the station of hand of the cause because of her enormous dedication and service to the cause for 27 years from 1919 to 1946. The Guardian's informal appointment in 1946 is clear in the cable passing from the hands in the Holy Line to her reveal this when upon her death that her ceaseless services maintained until her last breath signify a life dedicated to the faith. So both of these are true. I do know that there are references to other hands that we don't know about, that perhaps never were officially appointed, but in this case, not only was there the will to appoint her in 1946, but the actual formalization of it 5 years later, 4.5 years later. The next example is one that came about because I had heard different things from different people. It's nothing in particular that is written, but it has to do with her leaving her vast estate to the faith and virtually everything. So, example 5.
Millie herself never mentioned anything about her generous contributions to the faith, many of them made directly to the beloved Guardian. Even after his passing, many of these activities were continued, as she had arranged for them to be, and they were kept confidential, as was her wish. Whenever Millie would offer a contribution at a meeting of the hands of the cause, she would urge us to keep it confidential.
Just send the money, she would say. Don't mention my name. Or she would say, I am ready to help. Please don't mention my name. She never expected or wanted to receive acknowledgement and praise, much less any public announcement. But we know that the contributions to the faith are confidential. But this raises another issue that upon death, if a will passes through probate, then it becomes public record. So how to reconcile the fact that she did have 27 living heirs upon her death? She had 2 brothers, 1 sister, and this is out of a family of 14. And from them, she had nephews, nieces, great-nephews, great-nieces. Another point is her actions from 1946 to 61 reveal her intent. So in examining all of these things, it's important to look at the probate documents It's interesting that there are so many actions taken from 46 to 61. Beginning January 15th,
Millie deeded her Wilmette property to the temple trustees for the benefit of the NSA, with her receiving life usage.
so I'll give you a little history on that, which you may already know. For years, she had wanted to live in Wilmette. And of course, during the lifetime of her husband, many years were spent in California, where they built quite a staggering house. And then upon his death, she sold it quite quickly and then built 2 rooms onto her brother Oscar's house in the Phoenix area. So this was her base. The hot dryer did her a lot of good. And then her dream of building a home became a reality in 1946. She built a 2-story home. The bottom part was used as an apartment to be rented out. But she didn't keep this home for herself. So her first action, as soon as it was finished, was to deed it to the United States, NSA. I guess it was still Canada at that time. They didn't separate till 48. So on October 6, 1947, the following year, or a few months later, she created the Amelia E. Collins Revocable Trust, number 18252, with the NSA as beneficiary, again with her receiving life usage. The Northern Trust Company that dealt with all of her stocks and financial dealings was the trustee. And then she had a Bahá'í also who worked with them.
On December 14, 1950, Millie deeded the furnishings of the Wilmette property to the temple trustees for the benefit of the NSA, with her receiving life usage. On July 28, 1952, Millie updated the Amelia E. Collins Trust number 20833 with NSA as beneficiary, and she receiving life usage, plus small gifts to Ed Collins, Arthur, Carl, Oscar, Bertha, Barbara Engelder, and Paul Haney.
I'll just explain. Ed Collins is the brother of her husband. Arthur, Carl, Oscar, Bertha are her 3 brothers and sister, and Barbara Engelder is a relative. Paul Haney at the time was the trustee. On October 23, 1958, she amended the Second Amendment of her 1952 trust. By this time, Paul Haney had gone to the Holy Land and was replaced as trustee by Arthur Dahl. And she changed the amounts to the relatives, and I think that was the main change that she did with that. Let's see. On October 25th,
she made her last will and testament, leaving personal items to Lou Engelder, Valdemar Gallman. Haifa belongs to Ruhichanan and Bora Kavalin.
So she left her Haifa belongings to Ruhichanan, some personal items to her sister-in-law Lou, who's Oscar's wife, and Valdemar Gallman is the nephew of her sister, who was a diplomat in Poland and who studied the faith for a while. So I believe she left him something like a silver coffee set with a tray and coffee pot and creamer sugar, that kind of thing. On September 22nd, 1961, she added a codicil to her last will and testament, revoking the gifts to Valdemar and Bora Kavalin. I don't know the reasons for that. Maybe she had made something personal and didn't want to include it in a formal way. I really don't know the reasons. On October 4th?
October 4th, 1961, she revoked the Fifth Amendment of her July 28, 1952 trust.
So when she did this, it had to do with the stipulation of the number of days before a trustee could be changed. And it also had to do that she wanted everything in that trust to go to the NSA in the name of her husband, Thomas Hodson Collins. So, as I said before, at her death, she had 7 living heirs. And I thought that when I first saw the will that some of these had inherited, because there's a long, long list with their names, their addresses. It's listed as heirs and devasees. Devasees are people who inherit property. But as she had really no property, they would not have inherited. Some individuals inherited nominally, like Leuengelder and Rechanum. She also stipulated Leroy Iwas should Rechanum predecease Leroy. So I would say that in this synthesis, we have to observe her actions before her death. And in particular, this paragraph F of her trust, I think, says it very clearly, which I don't think you have on this screen. Upon my death, the trustees shall pay over and distribute in the name of my deceased husband, Thomas H. Collins, the entire remaining principal of the trust state, together with any accrued, accumulated, or undistributed income therefrom to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, having its national headquarters at 536 Sheridan Road, Wilmette, Illinois. So, moving on to 6 and 7, one is a corollary of the other, and that is a lot of people have the impression that Millie's chief contribution was monetary. And some people may even have the idea that Shoghi Effendi appointed her as a hand of the cause because of her generous contributions. Well, could they ever be wrong? Of course, she was very, very generous. Her first act and her last act were monetary, but it was her generous heart that drove everything she did. If you think about any wealthy person, they can choose the lifestyle that they want. Millie could have chosen to just sit around and watch the happenings of the faith, but that was not her nature. Beyond her contribution, she served in many capacities, and often with difficulty because of an ailing spouse, or even because of her own ailing health. She taught the faith wherever she was. She taught children's classes at one time in the 1920s, and she adored them. She held devotionals always. She did study classes, and usually many of these were based on the Guardian's letters. She actually went home front pioneering when she moved to the Phoenix area. And she and Oscar and Lou and one other formed a group, and then that group became an assembly, and it became the first rural assembly in Phoenix area. She was heavily, heavily involved in administrative work of the faith, from LSA to National Teaching Committee to the National Spiritual Assembly. She was actually elected for the first time to the National Spiritual Assembly after having only been a Baha'i for 5 years. She served on many committees, the National Teaching. She was extremely active with the Geyserville Summer School and helping its development. She worked very hard for the assembly development, which caused her to travel to many localities to encourage them to form their assemblies by Rezvan, or to maintain their assemblies. She did the similar work for the Inter-American Committee, but on a basis, in more of an international basis, especially to Mexico and then through South America. She made several trips. She was on a temple committee. She was on a program and feast committee. She served on the International School Committee in 1947. She felt she could no longer serve on the Inter-American Committee, but they requested that with her knowledge and experience that she remained a liaison. And then she was also a liaison between the NSA and the Pioneer Development Committee. And another important work she did, she was a liaison for the NSA with the matters of Ahmad Sohrab. And in the beginning, she was extremely open-minded, wanted to hear his side of the problem, and she tried to make him understand this is the first time in religious history that we've had a guardian. She also served in Latin America and worked with the indigenous when she was there. Not to a great degree, but she certainly spoke to many different groups. She never considered herself to be a public speaker or a writer, and the guardian told her, never mind, you do it anyway. So as a speaker, she would often carry out his wishes, or she would speak about the guardian, as we know so well in her beautiful tribute to Shoghi Effendi. As a writer, she recorded not only that tribute, but her first trip to Latin America, when she went there in 1942 on the Guardian's behalf to erect the monument, or make sure that the monument was erected properly to May Maxwell in Quilmes, outside of Buenos Aires. She always instantly obeyed Shoghi Effendi's directives, whether they were personal, administrative, teaching, and she often anticipated his needs. So I think these are huge arguments that this thesis is totally partially incorrect or partially true. So while it is true that Millie gave generously to the cause, as attested by many letters from Shoghi Effendi, that was not all that she did for the faith. She lived her faith by observing Millie's vast and sacrificial work in the teaching and administrative fields, all done with love and instant obedience. Both of these theses are false or partially true, however you want to look at them. So in conclusion, for the first three examples, all three are personal narratives that possess elements of truth from her historical and personal perspectives, but a literal interpretation does not reveal the whole truth. This in no way relegates them to secondary importance, nor belittles their author. And while there has been no access to Hand of the Cause A.Q. Fazie's papers, his Saturday secretarial assistance to Millie in the Holy Land during her last years, coupled with his remarkable memory, makes it questionable a record of multiple errors by him. Thus, observation and reading between the lines become important analytical tools regarding Hand of the Cause Amelia Collins' actions and statements recounted in her stories. For the other examples, the truth of the non-personal narratives becomes apparent through Millie's actions, which are supported by the guardian's words and through public documents. By using a dialectical approach, the discourse becomes clear. The spiritual and symbolic meanings of Millie's stories and deeds have to be sought. With her Christian background, she was undoubtedly aware of Jesus' warning. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Through careful examination of the examples presented here, their powerful import is evident. Amelia Collins was a stalwart servant and upholder of the faith from the time of the Master, from beyond the time of the Guardian, until her death during the interregnum years. No wonder she frequently signed her letters, "Faithfully yours." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That's really a fascinating presentation about, it's really a nice way of summarizing her entire life, what you did, I think, capturing the major aspects of her service through this dialectical approach. And so I really appreciate that aspect of this as well. And I'm sure this will continue to be a useful corrective for some of the statements circulating, of course. Let me see if we've got any particular comments yet. I go up here to the comments. Here we are. So we don't have anything yet. Do we have any idea how she reacted to that letter of the guardians appointing her a hand in what was 48?
Oh, that's such a good question, Rob. The guardian does answer her many letters. He was so busy. But first of all, her letters to the guardian are personal and private. However, the Baha'i World Center has been very generous in giving me summaries of the letters that I ask for. What did she write to the guardian? And they will give me a short summary. However, they've not found this letter. So her archives are not particularly well organized yet over there. It's not a priority at this time. So they haven't found it.
Mm-hmm. You mean the letter of hers responding to his appointment?
Mm-hmm. You can just imagine what she would have said. I don't deserve this.
Yeah.
Are you sure? So
yeah, exactly.
When they find it, I will ask for a summary, but they haven't found it yet. And curiously, that cable hasn't been found. Mm-hmm. And it only appears in the Priceless Pearl. So.
Right. Ruhia Khanum must have found it, or maybe she had heard about it. Yeah, that's intriguing.
So some of Millie's papers in the National Baha'i Archives in Wilmette are actually part of Ruhia Khanum's estate.
Huh. Yeah. Interesting.
And it's good to have Ed there because he's a good link between the World Center and the archives.
Right. Ed Sevchik, who's head of the archives in Wilmette, but who also goes frequently to Haifa to help with their archives as well.
Yeah.
Barbara asks, what was the reaction to her becoming a Baha'i from her Lutheran family?
That's a very good question. I don't know if they had an immediate reaction or not. I do know that several of her family members became Baha'is. I do know that one brother gave her a very hard time, and I think I know which one it was.
Uh-huh.
Of the family members who became Baha'is, she had a brother named Albert and his wife Salome and their daughter Dorothy Graff. Dorothy became a Baha'i before her parents, and she was a young woman. And while Amelia and Tom still lived in Massachusetts, Millie had the great bounty of deepening this niece, and they had wonderful, wonderful sessions, and the girl was very active. Then the parents came into the faith. The parents lived in Cleveland. The girl married, and I'll tell you the rest of the story in just a minute. Besides that, Oscar, her brother, who in Phoenix became a Baha'i. She had a cousin named Mrs. Norton, who was in San Francisco, became a Baha'i in the 1920s, I believe. And then, of course, Tom, about 3 years after he passed, around 1940, the Guardian confirmed that he had reached the Upper Kingdom. So let me go to Theodore. Theodore, she had Conrad Jr., who was a minister. And it could be that in service to him, this is where she met her husband, Tom, in Michigan. We don't know for sure where they met. But she had another brother right after Conrad, Theodore, who was a quite German scholar. And they were, Lutheran at that time. The churches, her father gave the services in German. And Theodore was connected with a seminary. He was quite a scholar and a professor there. And I believe that he is the one that she wrote to the Guardian about with great anguish. She had a brother-in-law who was a Presbyterian minister as well, married to Bertha Harries. And I forget his first name, but he finally, after many years, asked her about the faith, and they had a 3-hour conversation. But of course, he didn't leave his profession.
Interesting.
So I don't know the exact reaction because she became a Baha'i after great anguish. Her husband, as you probably remember, had gone off to the war, had gone to Paris, fallen in love with a nurse, come back and asked for a divorce. And they were very wealthy. They had already made their fortune. They had lived in Phoenix. And I suspect she knew something already of the faith in the early 1904-3 period when Nellie French was there with her husband in the mining business in the Arizona area. And she would have observed that once a year, Nellie would go up to Chicago for these meetings, of course, with Carola and so forth. But because of Carola's actions, Nellie French became very estranged from the faith. She never left it, but she was not particularly active until she went to California a few years later. And then her faith was rekindled, and then she got really busy serving.
Yep.
So to answer Barbara's question, I honestly don't know what the result was.
Well, it was a mixed result from the sound of things because some members were unhappy and some actually came behind. So
her father actually married them in 1894. She was not a Baha'i there. And her own husband, of course, had so much trouble. He was cold and hot to the faith because of the time that she served in it. And there is a postcard or something from someone who she said, it's all right to use this language with us, but they already think we're crazy, kind of thing, like the language, the lingo, if you will. Yeah, the Baha'is often use don't make sense to others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Teresa asks basically whether you're done with your research and whether you've got a complete story now to have a compelling and complete enough story now, or whether you need more documentation.
No, I'm done. Yeah, I'm just cleaning things up at this point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's horrible when the protagonist dies, you just cry and cry because you spent these years with that person. And so many beautiful stories about Millie.
Well, at least it gives this whole account an arc. That's the marvelous thing about biographies is they have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
But I don't think there's any area of service or place on the globe that she doesn't have some kind of influence. I was trying, there's some institutes in her name, or there were, I don't know the exact condition. One in Bolivia that the Lopez Claros family used to meet in. And so I got some nice information from them. One in Mexico, one in Cuba, in Haiti. Yeah.
Interesting.
But the world conditions,
she traveled, of course, to Haifa. And you said she was on the pioneering committee for a long time. So I suppose that means she was quite familiar with the growth of the faith in Latin America. Did she go there? Did she go to East Asia or South Asia at all?
She mostly concentrated in Latin America and Europe. But before all of that work for the faith, she and her husband traveled the globe several times. Mm-hmm. So she knew these countries. She went where she was asked to go. She asked the Guardian at one point to pioneer to Iceland because she was very dear to Iceland. I think in 1923 or 23, coming back from pilgrimage, they had stopped at Reykjavik on a cruise, and she'd gone into this museum and met a lady who was particularly attracted to her message. And she stayed in touch with her and for years and years and years. And this lady is considered to be the first Icelandic Baha'i.
Oh, good.
And the story goes that one time at the dinner table in Haifa, she said to the Guardian, well, she never formally enrolled. And the Guardian just gave her a big, big smile because enrollment really meant nothing. The lady spoke and upheld the faith, and then, of course, helped with the Icelandic translation of Baha'u'llah in the new era. So enrollment is just a formality. It doesn't read the heart. Always.
Interesting. Paul asks, do you have the address of her property bequest in Wilmette? You don't have to state it aloud, just wondering whether you have it and if it's a historical site in the future.
No, it's a very practical site, and yes, I do have it. I think you know Linden Avenue quite well.
It's the Millie Collins house,
Yeah.
I believe, is how it's referred to.
Yeah, it's 121. Yeah.
Yeah, and the National Assembly, sometimes members of the National Assembly, when they were staying in Wilmette on a regular basis, often were living there.
Yeah.
In fact, and they've sometimes used it for guests as well, if I remember right. Go ahead.
Did I answer your question about her travels? I can go on and on about that if you wish.
I think so, but so she didn't get to Japan or India or anything like that as a Baha'i.
No, I don't recall any of that. No, Germany, she was sent by the Guardian at least twice. She actually met some of Hitler's men.
Oh.
But that you have to save that for the book.
Yeah. B says it was actually 1924 when she came to Iceland 100 years ago this year.
Okay, great. I was thinking it was 23, but yeah.
That's a nice
24. Yeah,
nice
thank you.
piece
Thank
of
you.
information.
Yeah.
Did she do extensive traveling teaching in the United States?
Oh, I think in her work, if you would call it travel teaching or just helping the assemblies, but of course with the first indigenous assembly or community, if you will, she spent a few days there. It was very hard on her at that time in her life, the travels. But yeah, she supported that a great deal. And she taught everywhere on trains and everything. And she wrote to someone and said, you know, when I don't find that anyone listens, I ask myself, why? You know, what did I do that they aren't interested? But so much of her life, especially in the States, is spent on trains going back and forth to NSA meetings or whatever. And
yeah, I was going to ask you how she got there. I assumed that it was the train. What do you remember? What years she was on the National Assembly?
Yeah, I get confused. I haven't looked at that for a while. But her first appointment, her first, that first year they had a strange practice of having 9 alternate members. So they would always be assured of 9 members meeting. But that quickly went away. That practice went away. I'm trying to think, it was 24. Let's see, she became a Bahá'í in 1919. So, yeah, 24 would be the first year. Then there was a gap. But she served quite a number of years. The reason of a gap was that during the 30s, her husband was so ill that she really had to devote a lot of time. And of course, he often wanted to be on the sea, so they would get on a cruise because his heart would be more calm. And he actually died on the sea en route to Rotterdam.
Wow. And now he's buried in California, if I recall.
Yes.
Right near Thornton Chase.
Yes, I think Willard Hatch is the other one, or Sidney Sprague, one of them, maybe both.
Yeah, Willard Hatch is buried there, I think. Yeah, that's true.
Sidney Sprague also, I think. Yeah. And she still, I think, has a deed to one of those properties or had it in her estate. But there's a lovely letter from Oscar after she passes saying that for several months she wanted to die in the Holy Land. And she was so ill. She had to be carried. It was just so sad. The arthritis that she had, being an autoimmune disease, affected her heart. So the official cause of death was heart failure. Yeah.
Interesting. And did she serve on the conclave also in Haifa?
The whole time.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And she and her Hanum signed it was unanimous, to oust Mason Ramey. They signed it. Yeah. The proclamation.
Do you have any reactions or awareness of anything that she said about that particular incident? Probably not, I suppose.
No. I think the only thing I've ever found that she's written about Mason was that Mason was a good correspondent. So he must, like Faizi, have helped her in Haifa with her correspondence because her hands were so crippled at times.
Yeah, unfortunately, those letters were all typed, too, because Mason Ramey had terrible handwriting.
Well, hers was not easy. And I had a lot of difficulty with some. You finally get used to it, but still there are a few words that I am not sure of. And of course, when she's riding on trains, that doesn't make it any easier.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Where did her money come from? What was the source of the wealth?
Yeah, she's being born into a family of 14. Of course, they knew how to be frugal. So when her husband made it from the copper mines in Arizona, he was very, very clever, but he has an interesting background. He was raised probably Congregationalist, if anything. His father was Irish, maybe Catholic, but the mother Congregationalist. And his father died very, very young. So then the mother took the two boys to her brothers, who then educated the boys and put them through mining college. So he wasn't a miner. He didn't go into the mines and do the work, but he knew the mines and he had good strategies. And the family had such a clever way of staying together, and they would offer shares to family members and friends. So everything, if they grew, everybody grew. And then they would be owners of banks, so they controlled it that way. And they all made a huge amount of money.
I don't see any other questions right offhand. Okay. Perhaps we'll be lucky that we'll get one or two more here. And trying to think what else I wanted to ask. And their finances survived the Great Depression also, apparently.
Yes. I want to bring up one very, very important point. I was thinking about this the other day. Some of the wealthy benefactors in the faith around that time. There's Phoebe Hearst. There's Mr. Schopflocker. Who else is there? There's I know there's one or two others. Oh, Florence Morton.
Yes, Florence Morton. Yep.
Millie. Anyway, what I think is very, very interesting about Millie, if you just think about the trouble Phoebe had with people asking her for money.
Yep.
Rarely did I find this in the letters. Rarely. There's one rather prominent Bahá'í who did. I will not mention names, and probably rightly so. But Millie would help if she could, but she would always say, this is the Depression, and I've had to make adjustments in my budget too, and this is a big chunk I'm making to take this trip, and I don't have anything else. So what I'm trying to say is that she channeled her money through the institutions. She was so smart. So by doing this through institutions, she avoided a lot of the personal grief that maybe Phoebe had.
Yeah, and of course, Phoebe Hearst was a public figure, and the entire world knew she was wealthy. So when she becomes a Baha'i and the Baha'is hear about it may very well be a lot of people were not aware of how much money Millie Collins had in the community. Yeah. So that might be a factor as well.
Yeah. Very discreet lady.
Yeah. Well,
she was very generous to even people around her. There was a lady in Phoenix, an elderly lady, that she set her up for life and did it through the institutions, because the lady was so poor on it. Her Social Security didn't go very far, and she was a very stalwart worker in the faith. And there are other examples. There's so many examples of her generosity.
That's very interesting.
She established a fund in the name of her husband, and I wrote to the World Center what happened to that fund. And I think eventually it went to the hands, and then, of course, once the hands ended, it's gone to the house, or it was always in the house. Yeah.
Well, over this period of time, it may very well now amount to an insignificant amount of money, too, unless they've maintained it. So that's always an issue over a period of time for any
exactly
of funds.
Yeah, money was not terribly important to her, except for what she could do with it. An example of that is how quickly she sold her house in California for something like $75,000, which it would have been worth millions. Pacific Palisades, and she sold to an actor who had plenty of money, and later on he came and said, I feel really badly how little I gave you for that house. What can I do? And she said, oh, just save the children's fund, give to that. And she didn't want remuneration.
Interesting. Well, I don't see any other additional questions. And so I think we're pretty much done for today. Nothing else I can think of to ask about as well. I should mention that we have in 2 weeks Hooper Markert speaking about the teachings of Baha'u'llah as they relate to the Bhagavad Gita. And then a week after that, Dwayne Herman is going to talk about why Barbara Ehrsom brought the Baha'i faith to Kansas. So we have these 2 webinars coming up in November, and I hope we will see many of you at those webinars as well. So that's it today from the Korean True Center for Baha'i Studies. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again sometime. Thank you also, Nancy, so much for having joined us. This was a fascinating presentation, and I look forward to seeing people again in the future. Goodbye for now.